We're going to start our unit on resistance or anaerobic training, just with a basic overview here. So we've got two main outcomes. So we've got some definitions, and then we're going to talk a little bit about potential ways to measure anaerobic capacity, right? We know we've talked about VO2 max as a measure of aerobic capacity. Well, it's not quite as straightforward with anaerobic capacity. So we've got four words we need to get the definitions of. So first is resistance training. And like it says here, this is training that's designed to increase strength, power, and muscular endurance. Now, oftentimes resistance training goes hand in hand with anaerobic training, but anaerobic training, these are activities that require maximal force, and as a result, they only last for a very short period of time. Okay, and so this is where you're relying on those ATP, PCR, and glycolysis systems. You're not relying so much on your oxidative systems. Okay, so think sprints, high intensity, just short duration activities. Okay, so strength, what is strength? Well, it's just how the muscle is able, or the ability of a muscle to generate force. And then power is the rate at which you're performing work. And so if you were in a physics class and they asked you, how do you calculate power? It's force times velocity. Okay, and so the same can be said with aerobic or anaerobic or any sort of exercise. You can calculate power, right? And so power during anaerobic activities is likely going to be much higher than power during an aerobic activity. All right. Now, as I said earlier, we've got a gold standard for aerobic capacity. That's VO2 max, but there isn't a gold standard, or like the one that people really go, hey, this is how we determine someone's anaerobic capacity. But there are a few options out there, and those are the Wingate, the critical power test, and the maximal accumulated oxygen deficit. Now, I believe all of you have done the Wingate test, okay? And so the way I describe it is generally it's a 30-second test with the resistance set to 7.5% of your body weight. What we can do is we can average the power output over those 30 seconds. And the way we're doing it is basically taking into account how many revolutions you are putting in with the bike and calculate using the resistance to calculate your power. Okay. And so you'll get hundreds or even maybe tens of hundreds. I wouldn't say thousands so much for most of us, but you're going to have a power output in the high, close to 1,000 depending on your size. But as many of you are aware, it's a really long 30 seconds. So I was actually downstairs in the lab just before I came up to record this, and we're looking at seeing if we can potentially do a 60-second Wingate for some stuff, and we've only had 1 out of 3 people so far finish it. So we might not be doing that. So then we've got the critical power test, and this is a test where you're trying to generate or see how much power can be sustained for a few minutes. All right, and so exercise can be sustained as long as the power decreases. And so we see that here. We've got power decrease as the duration of the exercise increases, right? And so we get to this plateau part, and at that plateau, we get to where this exercise, that intensity can last for several minutes. Okay, and so this plateau part, we call that the critical power. And so that's maximum power you can generate for a few minutes. And then the last one is the maximal accumulated oxygen deficit. This one's relatively new for me. It's one that I was looking at doing a study in or with altitude, and I'm still trying to figure out how to do it. And so what we're doing is how much oxygen are you using, and comparing that to how much oxygen we think you should be using. And this is done during what we call a supra maximal test. Okay. Now, all of you have done, or not all of you, but you've all seen a max test, and with the max test, somebody gets up to a certain intensity or speed and grade, and then they stop, right? Well, for this maximal accumulated oxygen deficit, they'll actually be working at a higher intensity. That's why it's called supramaximal. All right, but it doesn't last for that long, right? The problem is that trying to determine what that resistance or that intensity that you need to be going at to actually run the test. And so it can take several bouts. I've seen, this is probably the most, where you end up with like 10 supramax or submaximal bouts, and then you do 1 supramaximal bout, because you're trying to find kind of that sweet spot to do this. And so we've got Wingate, critical power, maximal accumulated oxygen deficit.